Thanks. So first, thanks, Barbara and Stephen, for putting this together and figuring out how to make it happen despite everything, and for letting me be a part of it. So this is co-authored. Oh, this is a project that I've been working on with my co-author Ahmed Alwishah. He's not here; he couldn't be here. And as I was just mentioning, he has not actually had a chance to vet this most recent set of slides. So don't hold him responsible for anything here. But this is all the result of us working together for quite a while on this. So the context of what I'm going to be talking about is late 15th century Shiraz. There are two figures that loom large in that context. One guy's named Dashtaki and the other guy's named Dawānī. Dashtaki has a bit of a reputation of being a bit of a maverick, prone to radical claims supported by minimal argument. Dawānī has a reputation of being a bit of a traditionalist, prone to extended systematic work. And they engaged in an extended, rather public debate on the liar paradox over several years. And our primary source, the thing we're looking at most carefully here, is a treatise that Dawānī produces, which he entitled "The Final Word in Solving the Paradox of the Irrational Root." So the paradox of the irrational root is a really weird name that ends up getting used for the liar paradox within the tradition. But that is the literal title. It's the paradox of the irrational root. It's about the liar paradox. It runs over a bit over 20,000 words in our draft English translation. And I'm excited to say that we are now in the final stages of nailing down a contract with Oxford. So hopefully this will be available for people who want to look at it in English not too long from now. So the text itself is not a commentary, but it borrows the structure of quotation and response from the commentary and super commentary tradition. So it contains lots of extended quotations and discussion of earlier proposals from the tradition, alongside extended quotations of Dashtaki's criticisms of those proposals, and then Dashtaki's own proposal, along with Dawānī's criticisms then of those proposals and Dawānī's criticisms of Dashtaki's criticisms and so forth. And then Dawānī presents his own proposal and responds to some objections from Dashtaki. So for more details about how that all goes, Khaled Al-Ruyab has a nice paper that came out last year that surveys sort of the broad history that's presented in Dawānī's text and some of the surrounding texts. But my plan today is to unpack Dawānī's solution, try to show how it's connected to earlier debates among grammarians within the tradition about what makes a declarative truth apt. So why declarative sentences are the sorts of things that can be true or false. Show how it's connected to the correspondence theory of truth that Dawānī inherits from Tusi, and suggest some strategies for Dawānī to resist Dashtaki's objections. Oh my gosh, I think we've been partially scooped. Ahmed and I, working together, work slowly. There's this lovely paper by Razakani that came out in 2018 that also offers an account of Dawānī's solution, and it covers similar ground to what we're covering here. And it's a great paper, and we agree with a lot of it. And there's a bit of difference in influence. He works to trace Dawānī's emphasis. He works to trace Dawānī's influence forward. We're working to trace it backwards. And then the key thing that's going to loom large in this talk is this notion of ḥikāya, which we're going to translate as imitation, and we're going to try to develop that concept and talk about the role that it's playing for Dawānī. He translates that as report, which we think obscures Dawānī's central idea, but also this is just, I hate to admit this, it feels like I'm a bad scholar, but we've only recently discovered the existence of this paper. Haven't had a chance to fully compare his analysis to our own. That's just our fault. So this talk is not going to represent an engagement with Razakani, even though it should, given the nice stuff that he's done in his paper. So I want to talk about Dawānī's. So what's Dawānī's solution? Here's Dawānī's solution. Truth and falsehood require not just correspondence or the lack of correspondence, but also a ḥikāya relation, an imitation relation. And Imitation, ḥikāya, cannot be an imitation of itself, either directly or via intermediates, as might happen in a liar cycle where one person says, what he says is false, and the other person says, oh, what he said was true. So if the truth conditions for a sentence fail to reach reality, that is, if they don't bottom out in the imitation of some fact other than their own imitating, then the sentence is neither true nor false and is not declarative. And Dawānī thinks that's what happens in all of the paradoxical cases that are liar-like. So I'm going to start by talking about the background theory of truth and correspondence that Dawānī gets from Al-Tusi, and that seems to be shared property of Dawānī and Dashtaki. That is, by the time you're reading Dawānī and Dashtaki several centuries after Tusi, this just seems to be the standard view, though they might disagree about some of the details. So Tusi says, we don't doubt that certain judgments, such as the judgment 1 is half of 2, or the diagonal of a square is not equal to its side, corresponds to the nafs al-amr. So nafs al-amr, literally, the translation would be something like thing itself. These are contrary to the judgments of ignorant people, such as the belief that the diagonal of a square is equal to its side, and other judgments that do not correspond to the nafs al-amr. This is from his treatise on the existence of the abstract intellect. Tusi goes on to say, then, so there must be an existence outside the mind such that the judgment expresses a correspondence between what is in the mind and this thing outside of the mind. And this is what is meant by nafs al-amr. So this phrase, nafs al-amr, the thing itself, being used as a label for the fact in the world to which a true declarative or proposition must correspond, looms really large in Dawānī's text. He uses it in lots of places. And this is the earliest we've been able to trace this back, but we're not at all confident that it's the earliest it goes. We haven't found anything like this, for example, in Avicenna. So tentatively, we're inclined to think that what we have here is a gloss on the correspondence theory of truth and how to think about it that has its roots in Tusi. Tusi also says in the same text that correspondence cannot be conceived except between two distinct individual things, united by that which corresponds in them. And in other texts, this is Tusi's solution to the liar. No sentence can stand in a correspondence or non-correspondence relation to itself, because correspondence and non-correspondence both require distinct relata. So self-referential sentences are neither true nor false, because they can't satisfy either the correspondence condition for truth or the non-correspondence condition for falsehood. Dawānī, in his commentary on Tusi, on this text of Tusi, the treatise on the existence of the abstract intellect, argues that the correspondence here requires at most a conceptual distinction, not a real distinction. And in our treatise on the liar, Dawānī rejects Tusi's solution on the grounds that many self-referential sentences are non-paradoxically true or false. So correspondence and non-correspondence cannot require distinctness in the way that Tusi thinks they do. Okay. So just working from there, we have a sort of standard account, correspondence theory of truth that seems to have its roots, at least in Tusi, though it clearly has other roots that go further back into Avicenna and maybe some other figures. So a declarative, that's habars, that's usually the linguistic item, the spoken sentence, or a proposition, the ḥikāya, that's usually the mental item, the mental judgment, involves a relation between a subject and a predicate. That relation either stands in a relation of correspondence or non-correspondence to a relation in reality. And if it stands in a correspondence, then it's true, and non-correspondence, then it's false. And like I say, this account is taken as a given background account by both Dawānī and Dashtaki, even if they quibble with some of the details. So with that in mind, here is a quote from Dawānī talking about what makes a declarative truth apt? So the nature of a declaring is the imitating of a relation in reality, either in a way that corresponds to reality, in this case it's true, or in a way that does not, in this case it's false. And the new thing here that Dawānī is adding that isn't showing up anywhere in any earlier figures that I've seen is the idea that the declaring involves an imitating. It involves this ḥikāya relation. He goes on to say, if a sentence is an imitating of reality, whether in a corresponding or a non-corresponding way, then it's a declarative. And if it's not, then it's a constructative. Okay, that's a weird neologism, and it's our own neologism. I'll explain in a moment what that translation means. For saying the one is half of two is an imitating of reality in a corresponding way. And saying the one is not half of two is an imitating of reality in a non-corresponding way. For in both cases, the thing recounted is the state of the number one, as it is in reality. And the state of the number one, as it is in reality, corresponds to the first and doesn't correspond to the second. And if you want, you may say that the first is an imitating that corresponds to reality, and the second is an imitating that does not correspond to reality. So, okay. First, this neologism constructative. So the word is inshā. This is our own neologism. The common translation that people have been using for this word is performative. That's because the distinction between habar, declaratives, and inshā, constructatives, looks extensionally more or less the same as Austin's distinction between declaratives and performative utterances. But the root idea in the tradition behind inshā is about creating or constructing as opposed to declaring. So that's different from Austin's root idea, which is about performing or doing as opposed to declaring. And it's going to turn out for Dawānī that that difference matters. So we're going to translate that as constructative rather than performative, but it's just meant to be a neologism that fits along with Austin's neologism, indicating you're doing something else. You're not declaring here. You're doing something else with language. In this case, you're constructing with language. So before looking further, I want to go backwards. So the grammarian Astrabadi, who dies in 1287, so that's a good, do my math right, 200 years before Dawānī is writing. He's not the first person to introduce this distinction between constructives and declaratives, but he's the first person that I've seen who makes the following point. So here's I'm going to read the quote. The most used example of the verb for the contractual constructives, that's a particular kind of constructive, is the past tense, such as I sold or I bought. And the difference between the constructive I sold and I sell, which is intended to be in the present, is that in saying I sell, a sale must obtain that is other than the utterance. And the utterance is intended to correspond to that which is an external reality. If the correspondence obtains, then the sentence is true, otherwise it's false. For this reason, a declarative is that which is possibly true or false, for truth is possible for the utterance insofar as it signifies it, and false is possible insofar as the utterance does not signify it. So what's going on here? So in Arabic, so like in, take Austin's classic example of getting married by saying, I do. In Arabic, if you want to seal a contract of sale, if you want to make a sale, the grammatical form that's preferred is just the simple past tense. So you say, I sold. But that's the same grammatical form that could be used to report on the fact that you sold something. So in one case, in the declarative use, either in the present tense, as Astrabadi talks about here, or even in the past tense, in the declarative use, the sentence is meant, the utterance is intended to correspond to a fact in reality. But in the constructive sense, in the constructive use, that's not what's going on. So here's what he says about the constructive. With respect to the constructive I sold, there is no external reality that is intended to correspond to it. Rather, the sale occurs in the present by the use of this utterance. And this utterance brings it into existence. So maybe even there you can see why the translation of constructive is meant here to try to emphasize this creative aspect that is seen as central to these utterances. You're creating a sale rather than reporting a sale. For this reason, it is said that a constructive sentence is not possibly true or false. For the meaning of truth is the correspondence of the sentence to external reality. Meaning of falsity is the non-existence of the correspondence to it. For if there's no external reality, how can there be a correspondence or non-existence of correspondence? Okay. So the puzzle, if it's a puzzle, that Osterbody is alluding to here is that some constructives, like I sold, have the same grammatical form as declaratives. Now, suppose that as a matter of fact, the relation in the constructive, the relation that is expressed between me and selling in I sold, corresponds to the facts and reality. That is, suppose I really did sell something. Why isn't the constructive then true? After all, it looks like the relation that you find in the sentence corresponds to a fact and reality. Osterobody's answer to that question appears to be in terms of speaker intent. He says there's no external reality that is intended to correspond to it. So it's a difference in my intent that makes it a constructive rather than a declarative. And so it's a difference in my intent that makes it not truth apt, even though it has a grammatical form such that it could be truth apt if I were using it in a different way. Okay, so now I want to look at what Dawānī does with this same set of issues. So Dawānī says, the point of a sentence being a declarative is to be an imitation of a relation in reality. And for this reason, you've heard some scholars say the relation in constructives is produced by an utterance without being taken from anything else. And this is contrary to the declarative relation, for it is taken from reality. And in calling them constructing and declaring, there's a clear reference to what we explained. For the origin in language of constructing is creating, and the origin in language of declaring is imitation of something that occurs. And this is more general than either being in a corresponding way or a not corresponding way. So this word that we've been translating as imitation, it's ḥikāya. The root can either mean resemble or imitate. But it seems clear to us that Dawānī wants a contrast between mere resemblance, which is correspondence. Correspondence is a kind of resemblance relationship between the sentence and the fact in reality. And resemblance together with ḥikāya, because mere resemblance can happen in the case of a constructive, like I just mentioned, but that doesn't make the constructive true or false. That's why our preferred translation here is imitation, because, let's see, I think I have a few more slides that we'll get further along on that. So there is a prominent use of ḥikāya in earlier grammatical works, for example, Osterbody. So Osterbody talks about the sentence, Zaid will say after tomorrow, I went outside yesterday. And the puzzle is, what's the right way to interpret I went outside yesterday? And what Osterbody says is, well, there's two ways of reading this. If you read this as an instance of ḥikāya, then you should take the speaker, me, to be imitating the words Zaid himself used. So you should interpret the tense and the indexicals relative to the context of Zaid's statement, not mine. So you can see there, right? I'm imitating Zaid's speech in my own speech is the idea. You might, yeah. So and my, I mean, in effect, this is something close to an explanation of the difference between direct quotation and indirect quotation. though it's not clear to me that it's quite the same thing. But there's another use of the word ḥikāya that would have been very familiar to Dawānī and might help you get a sense of the concept he's reaching for, even though, as far as I know, nobody uses ḥikāya in the way Dawānī's using it quite before him. So here's our analogy. This is not from the text. This is just us trying to help build a sense of how this relation might work and how we might understand this relation that fits with what Dawānī seems to want to do with it. So consider a portrait painting of Nelson Mandela, which represents Mandela because it's an imitation of Mandela. That can be so whether or not it is a good likeness of Mandela. That is, it might not resemble Mandela very much at all, but if it's an imitation of Mandela, then it still represents Mandela. Contrast that with a figure painting that happens to resemble Mandela, but does not represent Mandela because it's not an imitation of Mandela at all. It's just something that somebody painted, making it up out of whole cloth, as it were. It happens to be a very, very good likeness, but it's not an imitation. So apply this analogy now to sentences and facts. The idea is that a declarative sentence is truth apt because it's an imitation of a fact. And a true one is both an imitation and a good likeness. That is, it's an imitation that corresponds. And a false one is an imitation, but a bad likeness. It's an imitation, but it doesn't correspond to the thing that it's imitating. That's our analogy. Our analogy, let's see. Sorry, that's not what I was going to say. So, and Dawānī is precisely concerned about cases of constructives and declaratives. Sorry, what am I going to say? Whether or not a sentence is an imitation is not decided by its grammatical form. And this is shown by looking at all of the examples of constructives that have declarative grammatical form, but are nevertheless not declaratives, and so are neither true nor false. And there's a list of some of them. So there's I sold, which we already saw in Astrabadi, and I bought. And then there's some really intriguing ones, like Allah is the greatest, which, according to Dawānī, is not a declarative, and so is neither true nor false. Presumably, the idea is that it's being used to express. I'm blanking on the word. It's being used to as a pious expression of devotion, rather than as a declaration of some fact. So even though it happens to correspond to a fact, it's not an imitation of a fact, and so it's not the kind of thing that's true or false. Okay. So what does this have to do with the liar? So to make this have something to do with the liar, what Dawānī wants to argue is that self-imitation is impossible, and that all of the liar-like sentences, all the ones that cause trouble, at least in the contexts where they cause trouble because of self-imitation. And he starts with an example that inspired our Nelson Mandela example. So an aspect of this imitating is that what is imitated is determined in reality independent of the imitating. For if you say to an engraver, engrave an image that imitates this image itself, your sentence is fruitless. For if the thing is not determined first, the imitating of it would not be established, and this is necessary. And as you think about that example, engrave an image that imitates this very image that you're engraving, right? Think about that example. Notice that the engraving is trivially going to resemble itself. So imitation here can't just be resemblance. I mean, if you're Tutsi, you might reject that on the grounds that correspondence and so maybe resemblance requires two separate relata. But if you're Dawānī, you've already argued that correspondence, and so presumably resemblance, doesn't require two separate relata. So an image can resemble itself, but it doesn't imitate itself. And I think that the core idea here is that imitating has to be a kind of responsive thing that you're doing in response to an independent object. So you can't imitate your own imitating, as it were. Okay. So the basic idea seems to be that self-imitation is impossible because the imitated thing needs to be independent and determined first. Note that this is not a claim about speaker intention. It looks like it's an external success condition that needs to be satisfied in order to succeed at imitating something. So now applying that to the liar, here's what Dawānī says. The secret to this is that truth and falsity exhibit the relation which is an imitating of reality, and the relation which is considered by the speaker between his sentence and false in the case of the liar. So when the speaker is saying, this sentence is false, is not like that. For this sentence, in which false occurs as a predicate, is not an imitating of a relation that occurs in the nafs al-amr, in the thing itself. So that correspondence or non-correspondence in terms of existence could be conceived. So that can't happen. For correspondence and non-correspondence in this sense are conceived in a relation that is an imitating of an actual relation to the nafs al-amr. So when there's no imitating, there's no truth or falsity. For this relation has no actualization, disregarding what's found in the utterance, as in the case of the constructives. For regardless of whether this sentence is called a declarative or a constructive, it's not ascribed truth or falsity. That last bit, regardless of whether it's called a declarative or a constructive. So Dawānī's view is that it's not a declarative, but if you want to insist that to be a declarative is just a description of grammatical form, Dawānī will give that to you and say, sure, if that's all you mean, it's a declarative. But that's not Dawānī's own view. His view is it's not a declarative, because to be declarative is to be the kind of thing that can be true or false. It's not just a matter of declarative form or constructive grammatical form. And here's how Dawānī then applies the same idea to the Truthteller. So this sentence is true. If one says this sentence is true, referring to that very sentence, then it's incorrect to ascribe truth and falsity to it because of the lack of an imitating of the relation in reality. For truth and falsity are ascribed to a sentence, which is a declaring and imitating of a relation in reality, and the imitating of a relation in reality is missing here. Okay. And then finally, an application to liar cycles. So if the imitating does not end up at a relation in reality, but rather it is an imitating of itself, either without an intermediate or via an intermediate or intermediates, as when one says, my sentence at 2 o'clock is true, and then says at 2 o'clock, my sentence at 3 o'clock is true, and then says at 3 o'clock, my sentence at 1 o'clock is false. So we got this little circle here with 3 sentences. Then, as an account of itself, there cannot be a gathering of the actualization of this known relation with its negation. That's a bit of a mouthful. By the necessity of the impossibility of the gathering of the actualization of the thing with its negation, for there's no actualization of this relation except in the mind of the speaker, and this sentence is not an imitating of a relation in the nafs al-amr, thus it's neither true nor false, just as constructives are neither true nor false. So there's that messy bit in the middle about the actualization of known relations, but the thing I want you to focus on, for the moment at least, is the imitating relation isn't there. It looks like the imitating relation isn't there because we never reach a relation in reality. We just have various things imitating other things in the mind, imitating other things in the mind, or sentences imitating other sentences, and we end up in a circle getting back to a case where the thing is imitating itself via intermediates. So Dashtaki's objection is that this sentence is composed is true. Now, they both use this example. They never say much about it. I'm not 100% certain exactly what kind of composition they are thinking about. They might just mean the words in this sentence have been put together into an utterance. or they might mean something, say, syntactic about the sentence. The sentence has been put together, it's made up out of pieces. But it doesn't really matter. They both agree that this sentence is composed is the sort of thing that's true. And this sentence is not composed is the sort of thing that's false. And as Dashtaki points out, either this is an example of a sentence that imitates itself, but without being independent and prior to itself. I mean, clearly it comes into existence at the same moment that it's true. Or truth doesn't require imitation of the sort that Dawānī is after. And now, Dawānī's response is not all that satisfying. What he says is, look, this sentence is composed when it's referring to the same sentence is true. And this sentence is not composed referring to itself as false, despite the fact that the relation which is its content is not different from the subject. And the difference between it and the liar is that between its subject and its predicate, there is a relation in reality that allows the gathering of a known relation on account of its existence in the mind. So what is he saying there? He seems to be asserting that when we get to this sentence is composed, there's a relation in reality between the sentence and composition, and that relation has the right kind of independence or priority, that it can be the kind of thing that the sentence can then imitate. Likewise with its negation. This is contrary to the liar, for there's no relation in reality apt to be the relation which the content of that sentence is an imitating of in a corresponding way or a not corresponding way. The reason why this is unsatisfying is he just seems to be asserting that there's a fact there in the one case, and then asserting that there isn't a fact there in the other case. So Dashtaki continues to object. Dashtaki says, look, you're saying that imitating does not end at reality, but rather is an imitating of itself. That would be right if the liar sentence wasn't itself something in reality, but it is something in reality, right? I've said it. I said this sentence is false. There it is. And it seems like Dawānī needs to offer us some reason to think that the relation in reality between a sentence and its truth value is not appropriately independent, while the relation in reality between a sentence and composition, maybe its syntactic structure, is. So here's one possible response, though I think it takes us beyond, strictly speaking, what Dawānī says in the text. So Dawānī emphasizes the idea that liar sentences seem to involve attempted imitation that fails because it does not end at reality. So that talk of ending at reality, for anyone who's familiar with 20th century work on the liar, strongly suggests the kind of grounding constraint that Kripke and Herzberger introduce on truth in an attempt to try to solve the liar. This suggests here that Dawānī thinks there's a similar kind of grounding constraint on imitation. So let me just unpack that thought a little bit before backing away from it a little bit. So here is a quote from Kripke where he's articulating the grounding constraint as he understands it. So in general, if a sentence such as most of Nixon's assertions about Watergate are false, asserts that all, some, most of the sentences of a certain class C are true, its truth value can be ascertained if the truth values of the sentences in class C can be ascertained. Now, if some of those sentences, the ones in C, involve the notion of truth, then their truth value in turn must be ascertained by looking at other sentences, and so on. If ultimately this process terminates in sentences that don't mention the concept of truth, then the truth value of the original statement can be ascertained, and we call that sentence grounded. Otherwise, ungrounded and neither true nor false. So that's Kripke's intuitive idea. So most of Nixon's assertions about Watergate are false is the kind of sentence that can be paradoxical in some contexts, but not in all. So in that way, it's very much the same as all that I say is false, which is only a paradox if it happens to be the only thing that I say. So that's the kind of example Kripke's thinking about. So how does this differ from what Dawānī is doing? So Kripke here clearly articulates a criterion for grounding. The process must terminate in sentences not mentioning the concept of truth, and then more broadly, not mentioning any other semantic concepts. Dawānī never clearly articulates any such criterion. He just comes back to talking about not reaching reality and then talking about ultimately ending up just being a case of self-imitation. But a plausible suggestion on Dawānī's behalf would be that the process must terminate in a sentence that's not predicating a predicate that itself involves imitation. As we've seen, Dawānī seems to think that the central thing that makes a sentence truth apt is this imitation relation. So the truth predicates are distinctive for Dawānī because they don't just involve correspondence, they involve imitation. And so if self-imitation is the problematic thing, then Dawānī has, if he went this way, would have the beginnings of an explanation for why when the process does terminate in sentences that still mention the concept of truth, that's not satisfactory, that's not counting as reaching reality. So that point is something that Kripke and Herzberger never try to unpack. They just assume that, look, if you terminate in sentences that are still mentioning the concept of truth, then you haven't reached reality yet. And so one thought would be that Dawānī's concept here of imitation might help to unpack the reaching reality idea that ends up being central to this grounding criterion. But that's all going beyond what Dawānī actually does, as far as I can tell. Even in the case of the liar cycle, if you read carefully what Dawānī's complaint is, it's not that the chain of imitations never reach reality. That's not his full complaint. His full complaint is that they never reach reality because it always ends up being an example of imitation maybe via intermediaries. So he's still focused on self-imitation at the end of the day, not bottoming out in non-imitation. So the view is not as close to a contemporary grounding account as honestly I'd originally thought it might be when I was working through the text. Going back then to Dawānī's own view. So he needs to say that this sentence is composed, imitates itself. I mean, he wants it to be true. It's clear that the fact that it is reporting on is a relationship, is itself its own composition. So it needs to imitate itself and also correspond to itself, and thereby manage to be true. And he needs to contrast that with this sentence is false, which for some reason fails to imitate itself. And it seems to me that what he needs to say here is he needs to say that when you say this sentence is composed, even though you're imitating the sentence, you're not imitating the aspect of the sentence that involves imitating. Because what it is to be composed, what that predicate is predicating, is not something that involves imitation. On the other hand, when you say this sentence is false, that truth predicate, what it is for a sentence to be true or false, on Dawānī's view, is partially constituted by the fact that that sentence stands in a certain imitation relation. And so when you say this sentence is false, you're attempting not just to imitate the sentence, you're attempting to imitate the imitating that is constitutive of that sentence. And so it seems, and if you go back to the example of engraving. If you are trying to engrave an image that just, well, how to put this? This is an unformed thought. So because it's unformed thought, I'm not going to try to say it. So let me just talk around it for a moment. What's wrong with trying to engrave an image that imitates itself? Is the problem that the product can't be an imitation, can't be imitated by the process that produces the product? Or is the problem that what you're trying to do is imitate an imitating? And at this stage, I think for this example to be developed, it's going to depend a lot on what he means by image. So if he just means visual thing that's not representational, then that's one thing. But if he means like a image of like a portrait, right? An image that represents something, then you might think, well, wait a minute. In order to represent something, I need to be responsive to that thing. My imitating has to be an imitation of, now, if it's going to be, if the result is going to itself be this kind of representational image, then my imitating has to be an imitation of partially the imitating that makes that image representational. And that at least seems plausibly more problematic than merely producing something that, for example, happens to exactly resemble itself. So it seems like a fruitful place for Dawānī to try to push to us. Yeah, okay. And that's everything I had to say. There's a list of some references. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very intriguing talk, very dense. We have already a question. Okay, Doc, we will. Here we are.
The slides disappear, but never mind. My question is this. I know a little bit of Arabic. And in Arabic that I know, it's a modern Arabic, ḥikāya means story. Like the story of Trump's becoming president is of historical, okay? While in Hebrew, ḥikāya means imitation. So, if ḥikāya also meant story at the time that these guys were writing, which I mean, it's quite possible because these are two Semitic languages, then going through your slides with story in mind, will it destroy some of your later slides? Because you are constructing your slides and solution and understanding based on imitation in your mind. And a lot of the things that you said, if you say story, like this sentence is constructed and so on, it's not a story. Okay, that's it.
Good. So, I mean, so first, part of our collaboration, Ahmed's collaboration and mine, is that, oh my gosh, Ahmed's the one who knows the Arabic a lot better than I do. Now, ḥikāya, yeah, so, and this, I think it's absolutely fair to worry that ḥikāya might mean something else. Story is an option. Another option that's in the same space is report. And notice the difference in meaning between report and story, and how that interacts with the constructive versus declarative distinction. So stories, at least in English, are things you can make up, right? Reports aren't. Reports are more responsive, right? Yeah. I mean,
also means in modern Arabic, you can say talk. I'll allow you to speak.
Yeah, but it definitely has. So that one of the reasons for pointing out the technical use by the grammarians, where it's used to describe not any kind of report, right, but a report in the very words of the original speaker.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, yes.
Yeah. So that idea. So I think it has. I think I doubt there's anything decisive about Arabic use at the time that is going to settle the question of whether or not imitation is a good translation or a bad translation here. And Dawānī gives us no clues as to where he's getting his use of the term.
Okay. If we go to your slide 23.
Okay, yeah.
This is where you talk about the day after tomorrow. They'll say I did something yesterday. Right?
20.
That's the one?
You want that one?
Yeah, the one with that sentence.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, and there you talked about, you relied in explaining it about that you're talking about imitation. If you imitate, okay, so
yes.
That's actually it doesn't matter whether it's story, report, or imitation. I worked on sentences like this in the 80s, where I was modeling why certain the use of the tenses in English, and why a sentence like this is not acceptable. And because there is a change of direction in the reference. You are talking now, yesterday sends you backwards from now, and you want to use it as sending you backwards from the day after tomorrow, and therefore it sounds odd. And
you want the slide you want is the one about from Astra Body, from the grammarian.
The one that has the sentence on the top.
Come on, where is it?
David, just to let you know, I think your screen share is frozen, or maybe
yeah, I'm getting black. And
let me restart the share. Let me restart the share. I apologize for that. Is it back now?
Perfect.
That makes also sense as to why I had the wrong slide up and nobody was concerned about me having the wrong slide up. Okay. So we want, yes. Zaid will say after tomorrow, I went outside yesterday.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when you say the day after tomorrow, they will say, I did this yesterday. You are changing direction from tomorrow where the reference is now. And that's why in English, it sounds funny, but in some other languages, they don't. But in English, you really have to say the day before.
Or you have to put the tomorrow I went outside yesterday has to be put in quotes to transform it into a direct quotation.
You better do something because you expect you don't want a change of direction, but report or imitation will allow for that.
So the short answer to your question is, a lot hangs on our choice of imitation here. And our hope is that the proof is in the pudding, as it were, that as you look at what Dawānī's trying to do with the concept and the way he's trying to make a distinction between correspondence and imitating, and then the way that he uses the engraving example, which very much seems like the engraving example with the visual, that doesn't seem like that seems very much like it invites the imitation understanding. And the way that correspondence and imitation are being worked together and contrasted by him, which really nicely works if you think about correspondence as resemblance and you think about ḥikāya as imitation, right? That contrast is harder if you start thinking about ḥikāya as story or report. But at the end of the day, that's the best I've got by way of a defense of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Now we have 3 more questions and leave. So is it possible to limit yourself to 1 question for the next ones? So Ahmed.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Actually, my question is a textual one. Do you think that Dawānī has only one solution? He has a unified solution, or through these exchanges with Dashtaki, he actually changed his solution? Because it seems to me, and it's mentioned by also Al-Wahhab and Reza Khani, that it seems that he has more than one question, one solution, and it seems to me that in some places he doesn't really use the notion of ḥikāya in a technical sense, and it's true that in some places it has a very technical meaning, very similar to what you said. But in other places, it's not that, technical. He simply means reporting something without having those, other, technical meanings that you mentioned.
I don't have a settled view on this. I think it's entirely reasonable to think that his view evolved in response to Dashtaki's criticisms. So I think his early statements of the view are at best leaving a lot of things implicit, or at worst just not giving the full view because he didn't have the full view. And then his later statements seem to be adding more stuff. And Dashtaki's, and a lot of Dashtaki's understandings of what he's saying, if we assume that Dashtaki is a reasonably smart guy who's trying to understand what he's saying, they're weird misunderstandings if he was clearly communicating what he seems to be trying to say by the end of the final word when he's responding to Dashtaki. So I think absolutely plausible that the view is getting clarified and sharpened, and that what might have begun as a non-technical sort of intuitive use of ḥikāya develops into something more precise under the pressure of objections. But also, I should admit, one of the things we have not really had a chance to do is explore carefully other places where Dawānī is talking about truth, independent of the liar, and whether, for example, it's plausible to think that every time he talks about truth and correspondence, he's already got something like this worry in mind, and he's already starting to deploy something like the concept of ḥikāya to distinguish the declaratives from the constructives and all of that. We've looked at a little bit of stuff that does seem to suggest that he's sensitive to some of these things in other texts, but it would be really nice to know whether this is just something that's happening as he worries about the liar, or whether this is something that's developing out of a broader, more systematic set of views about language, and we're not in a position to know.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, the next question is from Light. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name.
Yeah. Oh, hello.
Hello.
Good evening. You hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you very much. Thank you for amazing lecture. Actually, I am Arabic, and ḥikāya is kind of story, which is short, as itself refers to the imaginary events which may happen in the past or present or even future, and may be false or true, clearness or has ambiguity. While imitation is an action of using someone or something as a model, some synonyms of ḥikāya is illusion, Is that right to translate ḥikāya as an imitation? Secondly, thank you, Dr. David. Can I get a copy of your lecture PDF downloaded? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm going to there's what exists by way of a lecture are the slides. I don't have a written transcript. I just sent it to the group chat. Can you? So maybe you can find it there. If not, I'm happy just to email it to you too. So this is why it's bad that my co-author Ahmed's not here, since at the end of the day, when it comes to questions about how best to translate Arabic terms in context, I rely on Ahmed. We certainly had a long discussion about this, and it's entirely possible, of course, that we talked ourselves into the translation of imitation because it fits so nicely with what we wanted to say about the text. But his judgment was, and again, I can only defer to his judgment was that in the context of the late 15th century, looking at the ways that people were using ḥikāya and thinking about what the root is and trying to think about what the concept might be here that Dawānī is trying to reach for, that something like imitation was a reasonable translation. The two basic roots are about imitation and resemblance, that's my understanding. But then, of course, it's got a whole bunch of other meanings that accrue to it. I don't know how to interpret the text except for by trying to make sense of what the concept is. I don't mean to be putting all of the weight on the claim that the dictionary translation of ḥikāya is imitation. I mean to be putting a lot of the weight here on the claim that if you take that shade of meaning, which seems like a legitimate shade of meaning to pull out, and you make that what he's talking about, then I think a lot of this makes good sense in ways that are harder to see if you focus on some of the other possible shades of meaning. But at the end of the day, Ahmed's the one who has to take responsibility for whether this is all right, because he's the one who has the scholarly chops to really know. Of the two of us, he's the one who has any scholarly chops to get in a debate about the proper translation of ḥikāya.
Okay, thanks. The next question, Tamer.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, David. Thanks very much for the talk. I found it really interesting. So I had a question about the division of labor between the correspondence bit and the imitation bit. So Dawānī thinks for truth you need both. So one question, you've already answered that, but I just wanted to get clear. Do you get a sense that he kind of reaches this view on the basis of reflecting on the liar, that you need both those things, or is it something that he's already, you'd expect to find evidence for elsewhere? That's not really the question, but I see you nodding, so then maybe I can follow up to the actual question. So I was thinking, when you were describing things early on, and you had the talk about the thing in itself, the nafs al-amr, if I remember correctly. It seemed like a really robust. I mean, I didn't see the texts, but the sense I got from the brief description was that it's a very robust kind of, almost like a truth maker, sort of like there's really like heavy metaphysics going on the facts side of things. And then I was wondering, if you put so much weight on that side of things, is there really all that much work left for imitation to do? Couldn't you just do it all by beefing up your notion of correspondence in that way? So I guess that was the question I had. Is there that much left to do if you sufficiently beef up the correspondence relation?
Good. So, I want to answer the second question by saying a little bit about the first question first. So it's unclear to me at this point whether Dawānī is thinking about this ḥikāya idea because he's been worried in the past about the puzzle about non-declaratives that have declarative grammatical form. That seems like one source. And there's pretty good reasons to think that he would have been familiar with that literature and familiar with that problem. So it's unclear to us whether he is taking something that he thought he needed over there and now seeing that he can also use it for the liar, or whether the other thing's going on in the other direction, or both at the same time. It's definitely the core thing he appeals to try to motivate the idea that truth requires this imitation is that distinction. And for what it's worth, Dashtaki just rejects the distinction. Dashtaki thinks that a constructative, like I sold or like Allah is great, it can also be true or false, and so is also a declarative. He just thinks that the distinction is not exclusive. And Dawānī reacts with amazement, like, how could you possibly think that? That's just beyond the pale, right? So Dawānī clearly thinks that this distinction is exclusive and that it's part of, everybody's going to agree that it's exclusive and we got to figure it out. So then if we're just thinking about that, there's a good reason not to beef up correspondence. Maybe. But I take it your real question is in the context of thinking about the liar, could we just beef up correspondence and then just deny that non-imitative, when cases where, as it were, Dawānī would say imitation fails, what's really gone on is the correspondence relation has failed. And I guess you'd need to also beef up non-correspondence, given that he's working with those two things as two separate things. I don't know. That's a really interesting idea. I need to think about it more. So I'm going to punt.
Thanks so much, David. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for the last question. Pri.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So if I'm reading you correctly, Dawānī thinks a liar sentence, like this sentence is false, is not truth evaluable. Is that right?
Yeah.
Because it's not a declarative sentence, because of constraints he makes on what declarative sentences have in relation to reality.
Yes.
Does he consider other approaches to liar sentences, approaches which you might find more common in the West, which do take such liar sentences to be truth valuable? And if so, how does he respond to such an analysis?
So he considers several prior proposals, and he considers Dashtaki's proposal. I'm going to get this right. Most of the proposals either go off in another direction by worrying about whether the sentence can really ends up being about itself and trying to find some way that it's not really about itself, right? But among the ones that seem to face the thing head on, with the exception of what you're going to hear about tomorrow from Opry, most of them embrace the idea that it's neither true nor false. And then Tusi, for example, is somebody who thinks it's neither true nor false, but it is declarative. And that's because he puts a constraint on truth and falsehood, that they require correspondence, and correspondence requires distinct relata. Dashtaki thinks that it's neither true nor false because, for reasons that are obscure and hard to make out, he thinks that it ends up having an empty subject term somewhere. And he thinks that sentences with empty subject terms are declarative but lack truth value. So Dawānī knows about those possibilities and he rejects them for various specific reasons. But I'm not sure if any of those are the things that you were wanting to see him reject. But yeah.
No, it's just that contrasting this solution, saying it's just not truth evaluable. It seems so different to what I think Harold's talk alluded to earlier when you list 5 solutions to the liar paradox, and the 5th one seems to be not truth evaluable, and he seems to reject that quickly.
So my sense, for what it's worth, is that in this respect, the Arabic tradition is very different from the Latin West tradition in terms of the range of views that were being discussed. That the focus on the focus on the idea that it's neither true nor false, and then the only question is whether that's because it's an exception to the general principle that declaratives have to be true or false, or because it's not declarative and so not truth evaluable, or exactly why it's not. They argue about that, but they don't go in. I mean, again, Opry is an exception. He thinks it's false, for example. But anyways, yeah.